It's my job to tell the story of the universe using these mathematical techniques, using data that becomes available from particle physics experiments and telescopes. But at the end of the day, it's storytelling. So I am a griot. I am a griot in the way that people who are put in my position can be.
I'm Michael Tamblyn, CEO of Rakuten Kobo. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest today is Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein, theoretical physicist and the author of The Disordered Cosmos, A Journey into Dark Matter, Spacetime, and Dreams Deferred. She was named by Nature as one of the 10 people shaping science in 2020, and she's the co-creator of the Particles for Justice movement, which this year won her the Edward A. Boucher Award for the American Physical Society. Her book, The Disordered Cosmos, is a layperson's window into particle physics, both as a set of theories and uniquely as a social practice. Science isn't just a set of laws, it's a thing that people do. It's beautiful and it's challenging, and it is such a pleasure to speak with its author today, Dr. Prescod-Weinstein. Welcome to Kobo.
Thank you for having me.
Your book is many things: a field guide to particle physics, a discussion of dark matter and its surrounding theories, the life and observations of a Black woman scientist pushing through in a white Western profession. But it starts with a girl with a book on a bus. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the first chapter, Heart Quirks, opens with me talking to people on the school bus about A Brief History of Time, the book by Stephen Hawking. And I'm, trying to convince people that quarks are interesting, even though I don't really know what quarks are. All I know is kind of this organized table that I think appeared in the book or is listed out in the book or something like that. So I was very enthralled with the idea of the standard model of particle physics, which is really what I was trying to tell people about, even though I didn't really understand what I was talking about. But I liked the idea of it, a lot.
And this had begun with a journey to a documentary with your mom.
Yes. My mother, I think because I really should ask her about this. I think she thought I needed enrichment, scientific enrichment. So one Saturday morning, she insisted that we go to a matinee on the other side of Los Angeles. So I grew up in East LA, and the only movie theater in town that was showing this particular documentary was on the west side. And she could only afford a matinee. So this meant 9 o'clock in the morning, we're driving across town to go see this documentary, A Brief History of Time. It's a documentary by Errol Morris about Stephen Hawking. And so that was actually, a lot of people hear about Stephen Hawking for the first time through the book or that kind of thing. I actually heard about the book through the documentary, which in hindsight is kind of interesting because it was very much situating the scientist in his social and professional environment. And that was kind of my entree to theoretical physics. And so I complained the whole way. I was I don't want to go. I was probably missing X-Men cartoons, which was my jam. It was back when you had to be in front of the TV at a specific time in order to see the thing that you wanted to see. And I really just complained, and I was why are we here? And then halfway through the documentary, Stephen Hawking was talking about solving physics at the center of a black hole and how this was a problem that remained unresolved, that he had spent his career working on, and that Einstein hadn't worked out. And at that point, I was whoa, you can get paid to do math all day and do math that Einstein hasn't figured out. And I think it was as much it was an economic calculation for me also. As a kid from a working class household, I knew I had to have a job, and that just seemed like the best of all worlds.
And so you went on a campaign then to get the book as well.
Yeah, pretty much walking out of the movie theater, I was I have to have this book. Mom, buy me the book. Mom, buy me the book. And I should, just for people to understand, I understood that this was not a small request. We had very little, we didn't really have disposable income. And so asking my mom for books at all was not typically a thing that I did. So that was how badly I wanted it, that I just kind of overcame that barrier of like, what's normal? What's a normal request for me to even make? And I asked for this book, and my mom was kind of like, oh, well, I don't know if you should have that book. It's for adults. And, I was 10. So she actually said to me, I'm worried that you will try and read it, you won't understand it, and then you won't be interested anymore. And so my mom was really trying to protect my interest. Mm-hmm. And she, I think, told my uncle to get it for me for my 11th birthday, because somehow my uncle knew to get it for me for my 11th birthday.
And speaking as a bookseller, The Brief History Time is well known as the most purchased, least read book maybe in the history of publishing. So she wasn't protecting you for no reason, but you got this book in hand. And as an 11-year-old, you crack it open. And how does the story of your engagement with physics go on from there? Because for a lot of people, that would be the end. you would run into Stephen Hawking's book, and then it's right back to X-Men.
Well, I was still watching X-Men, just for the record. Still, to this day, turning 40 next year, still watching X-Men. It doesn't have to be either or, thankfully. That's
absolutely not. Can be and should be both.
Can and should be both, exactly. Somewhere in there, sometime in the next year or so, I found Stephen Hawking's email address and sent an email asking how to become a theoretical physicist. So I was very hyper-focused on okay, how do I make this a reality? For me, it was a practical question. It wasn't just oh, what are quarks? I was actually what is a theoretical physicist? What are the requirements for this job? And how do I get it? That was basically I wanted to know what I needed to do at that point to get the job. And so that became part of my journey as well. One of his graduate students wrote back to me and explained that I had to get a bachelor's degree from a top university, and then I would have to get a PhD, and then I could become a professor. And so I made a plan.
And so aside from that book, what else was your reading life like? What else was your engagement with science like when, kind of before you hit university?
I was not one of those kids who was just all science, science, science. I think that that's actually really important, because I think that there is this kind of stereotype, not at all helped by the TV show Big Bang Theory, that, people who go on to become theoretical physicists are sort of one-track mind. But going into that, especially at age 10, I was reading a lot of Jane Austen at that point. And that was I was at a point where I was starting what, in my view, is a lifelong love affair with Jane Austen. And I was also reading The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy for the first time around that time. And so I was interested in a lot of different things at that point. And I was very bookish. I also read Alex Haley's Roots for the first time around that age. So that's kind of, none of that is oh yeah, theoretical physicist. Maybe right. People think Lord of the Rings is theoretical physicist-y, but really elves, we don't work with them very much.
There are, though, a lot of barriers that a young girl and especially a young woman of color has to clear or push through in order to make it anywhere in a career in STEM. What did those barriers look like for you?
I think one of the major barriers for me initially was actually recognizing the barriers. One of the things that happens is that you're just kind of chugging along and you're why are these things happening? Why does it seem like things are going differently than for other people who are kind of around me? Particularly if I'm like me, you don't go to an HBCU. So I think students who go to historically Black colleges and universities actually have a very different experience with this. There's a reason that Spelman, which is a relatively small women's college, but it's a historically Black women's college, is one of the top producers of Black women who go on to PhDs in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. They're having a very different experience, right? At a predominantly white institution, I was at Harvard for college. I was trying to figure out, like, why does this feel different? Why does this look different? And I think, like, that barrier by itself is one thing. And then it is the things that are different. The fact that I had a different class background from most of my classmates at Harvard. In my entering class of 1600, there were only 3 of us who were from East Los Angeles, and California is one of the biggest feeders. The Los Angeles metro area is one of the biggest feeders for Harvard. But our side of town, which people at Harvard were constantly telling me, oh, isn't that a bad neighborhood? When I would say I was from Los Angeles, they'd be like, oh, where are you from? And I would say East LA, and they were like, oh, I think you're not supposed to go there. And then, like, you talk to the other kids from Los Angeles who said they were from Los Angeles, I'm putting this in air quotes, and they would be like, yeah, I'm from Malibu. And I would be like, that's not actually LA. Like, are you guys even in LA Unified School District? Like, there was a lot of that. So I think there were the class issues, and then I had a certain political consciousness that was rooted in my identity as a Black person, that people just didn't get. And I felt very alienated because people didn't get it. I felt like I was seeing things that other people like didn't recognize because they didn't have to recognize the social phenomena. And so there's a lot of alienation and feeling very lonely.
And were there any resources, or were there any people who you drew on to help you push through some of those barriers? Were there, was there anything that, aside from your own personal resources, to help you get through those?
Yeah, I mean, my mother, Margaret Prescod, probably the most significant source of support through that time. In that, like, towards the end of my first semester of college, I called her and was like, I'm dropping out of physics. I'm switching to anthropology. I had this foolish idea. I believed in the hierarchy at that point. So I thought physics was harder, right? It's just different. I don't think it's harder. But at that point, I just thought anthropology would be easier for me to do. And frankly, that was kind of like the messaging that I was getting. And my mom basically said, I did not work an evening job as a secretary so that you could stay in that magnet school just so you could quit on your dreams during your first semester.
Not to put too fine a point on it.
No. I mean, my mom's from, I think anybody who has Caribbean parents who's listening, it was like maybe the most Caribbean parenting moment that, like, I experienced in I was 17. That was like my first 18 years. And then, interestingly, it was at some point during that first year that I picked up a copy of Carl Sagan's Cosmos. And that book ended up sustaining me in a really significant way. Also, and maybe people will be surprised to hear this, reading F. Scott Fitzgerald was really important. So I had read The Great Gatsby in high school. I will say, like,
You're on a book podcast, so tell me more.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, like, the key thing that sometimes people miss about F. Scott Fitzgerald is that, yes, he was part of the milieu he was writing about, but he wrote about it very critically. Like, he was just basically like, hey, everybody, look at us. We're gross. Like, we're super gross. And reading him, I was like, he's writing about the Harvard crowd. And so it was a little bit like, the gaslighting that I felt like I was experiencing when people were like, no, actually, the environment's perfectly fine. I was picking up these books that were almost at that point, like, a century old. Definitely to me at age 17, they seemed like a really long time ago. That was basically like, no, this place is basically exactly the same as it was, like, almost a century ago. And that was really, like, it was an anti-gaslighting technology for me. So I think that told me, okay, the things you are seeing, those are real. And then reading Cosmos was like, no, the Cosmos actually is great. It's just that your classes suck.
So it's almost like we need to put together a kit for people that are entering Harvard, which includes the anti-gaslighting, literary syllabus. Yes. So you can look around and go, yep, still gross. and just keep right on going. One thing that struck me about your educational journey, through grad school and then into PhD is reading about how, as a scientist, and especially a physicist's area of focus is often a matter of chance. That, yes, sometimes people have an all-consuming drive to study a particular branch of particle physics, but sometimes it's the result of what research opportunities are available, and that sort of shoves you in a certain direction. Can you talk about how that played out for you?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting phenomenon that I think maybe is not always well understood by the public, and definitely not families who have like budding scientists. And there are a lot of areas of physics that are not really widely discussed in popular science literature, right? Like a lot of people have heard of particle physics, have heard of cosmology. If I say condensed matter physics to you, you're like, what's that? Or the older word for that is solid state physics. People kind of don't know what that is. I think things are shifting in that I think everybody's heard of quantum information, even if like most of us can't define what exactly quantum information means. So students come into graduate school, into PhD programs, excited about the things that they've heard about. And so we tend to have a disproportionate representation of students who are excited about doing particle physics and cosmology. And astrophysics. And then within astrophysics, I think probably at this point, a lot of people are very excited about exoplanets because there have been lots of new discoveries of extrasolar planets. The reality is that there isn't money for all of the students who want to do that thing. And so sometimes people have to figure out, am I excited enough about being a physicist that I could be a physicist doing this other thing and not the thing that I had become attached to? And I'll be honest and say that I'm still thinking about what it means that I ended up doing the thing that I wanted to do. Not because people were ready to open the door for me. It was the complete opposite, right? The theoretical physicist in particle physics is considered the top of the intellectual hierarchy, the smartest of the smart, the students who are the obvious stars. And for various reasons, I was not that obvious star in college. And so students like me are discouraged from thinking that they can pursue particle physics or cosmology. Or if we're going to do it, we have to do it as experimentalists, not theorists. We're not, quote, smart enough to be theorists. And I'm just really stubborn. And so here I am. But I had an unusual path that also involved changing graduate programs. I started a PhD in astronomy. I realized that I wasn't really fitting into that department, and I transferred to a PhD program in physics to work at the Perimeter Institute in Waterloo, Ontario in Canada, which at the time was only like 5 years old. I ended up being their first cosmology PhD. So I was an experiment in a lot of ways, and that ended up being what I had to do in order to get to where I wanted to go, because the traditional paths were not open to me.
And so when people ask what you do now, you say that you are a particle cosmologist. And as you describe it, you use math to figure out the history of space-time. And you are not the first cosmologist that we have had on Kobo in Conversation. And so should anyone want more cosmology, do listen to our conversation with Katie Mack about the end of everything. But you are the first particle cosmologist. So talk a bit about how in your area of research right now, particle physics and cosmology fit together.
I guess I should say, actually, that Katie and I do very similar things. And so I'll just, being me, the person who thinks about the social and the science together, I'll just comment that there's like a whole social aspect to what is the nomenclature, what are the words that we use to describe ourselves.
Okay, let us know.
And so, Katie and I even have crossover. We both have written several papers about dark matter. I think that we would both say that we specialize in dark matter. And the dark matter particle that we've both written about the most is the same particle, the axion. And she ended up graduating from an astrophysics program, and I graduated from a physics program, right? So it's just, sorry, I'm totally not answering your question, but I just had to throw in that aside.
That's great. Excellent.
Partly because Katie and I actually first met as prospective students at the astronomy program that I initially started my PhD in. And so we're actually interesting comparison points for like how did these things evolve. In different ways, what we both do is think about how the very small, like how physics at the particle, at the quantum level, impacts the universe on large scales. And so I think dark matter is a really great example of how these things come together. So we think that the majority of matter content in the universe is this invisible thing that gravitates, but light goes right through it. So I'm calling it invisible. It's transparent. Unfortunately, we call it dark matter. If you remember nothing else from this podcast, dark matter is transparent. Dark matter is invisible. Light goes through it. We think it's a very small thing. It's a subatomic scale particle, but it is so dominant in the universe that it affects how galaxies evolve. And so then we're talking about very large, what we call large scale structure. And so particle cosmology is really the bringing together of the particle physics and the cosmology. How does the evolution of space-time and large structures in space-time, how is that affected by what happens on the small particle scale?
You are also the first Black woman to hold a tenure-track faculty position in theoretical cosmology. But as you say in the book, you're certainly not the first Black woman to be a griot of the universe. Can you expand a bit on that particular turn of phrase for me?
Yeah, I think one of the challenging things about being part of the Black Atlantic, maybe the fundamental challenging thing about being part of the Black Atlantic in some global sense, is that we are descendants of people who were ripped from their indigenous identities. And my mother was in fact born in a chattel house in Barbados. And so slavery really shapes our understanding of like our ancestry and our ability to connect with our ancestry. And so where the word griot comes in is griot is in West African communities. This person is a storyteller. This is the keeper of the stories of the community. And so I have taken on that understanding of myself, even as I can't identify which of those communities my family actually hails from. And I think for me, it feels like a very important thing to recognize that what I do as a cosmologist is storytelling. It's my job to tell the story of the universe using these mathematical techniques, using data that becomes available from particle physics experiments and telescopes. But at the end of the day, it's storytelling. And so I am a griot. I am a griot in the way that people who are put in my position can be, in some sense.
There is a real interweaving in this book because you go from talking about that role to then a very graceful pivot into a discussion of cosmic inflation and cosmic microwave background radiation, and then back to talking about how the certainty or at least supportability of these theories draw from the Western European accumulation of science, and that can sometimes feel like an uncomfortable place for you. You also note that this is far from the only scientific tradition of cosmology that's available to us. And I'm wondering if you can expand on that a bit.
I think there are a few interesting things there. One of the pieces is when we talk about why did Europe converge on science as we understand it, science as a method, science as a collection of information. When you really think about part of the function of colonialism is taking from other places and aggregating and pulling things together, then it makes sense, for example, that there are going to be advances in understanding like plants. I think plants are something that's like very easy for people to grab onto, and they understand that there are different plants in different parts of the world. And then suddenly you have one group of people who are traveling to different parts of the world, learning information from the people who are there, and then taking it back and putting it all together. And then This is almost like you were doing, this is like sort of a bad analogy, but to help people kind of understand it, it's like you were doing a group assignment and then you took all the credit for all of everybody else's pieces. Like everybody else like gave you a piece of the group assignment and then like you wrote it up and stapled it together and just put your name on it.
And everybody hates that person.
Right. And everybody hates that person, right?
Yeah.
Colonialism and settler colonialism and imperialism are so much worse than that, right? Because like people are dying, there's the violence, there's the dispossession, there's the slavery, there's all the sexual violence, there's so many other layers to that. So it's just like, but science is produced as a piece of that, right? And so it is very complicated to be like, yeah, so I'm very interested in this information, even as I am extremely grossed out by how a lot of it came together and how it got packaged together. I think importantly, like if you read like Black Panther comic books, or even if like you went to see like the Marvel movie, the Marvel Cinematic Universe edition of Black Panther, you imagine a scenario where people can exchange those ideas without the colonialism. And so I raise this up, which is to say that I don't actually think that colonialism had to be the way that this happens. And we have to hold on to that idea that there are other ways for us to learn about the universe, to learn about ourselves, learn about our world, exchange ideas, and learn new ideas that don't have to be filtered through this thing. And so part of the way that I deal with it is by thinking about that and feeling responsible for advancing that approach to how we do science and why we do science.
And when you look at the scientific community today and different people who are practicing it from either coming from different traditions or coming from different cultural backgrounds, do you see examples of or hints of those other kinds of exchange being possible, as opposed to just kind of the, a continuation of that European accumulation model?
I think here I have to cite prison abolitionist Mariama Kaba, who talks about how hope is a practice.
Okay.
I feel cynical about it a lot, particularly, as a member of the astrophysics community. One of the many different nomenclature hats I wear is sometimes people say I'm a theoretical astrophysicist, and I'm like, sure. As a member of the astrophysics community, I have been on the front lines of the conversation about astronomy in Hawaii and the 30-meter telescope in Hawaii. And the building of it on Mauna Kea, which is contested by indigenous people in Hawaii, who don't have formal representation in the way that some of the recognized native tribes on the continental United States have recognition. And I have to say that conversation and the presumption by scientists that the telescope has to be built, that the 30-meter telescope has to be built, that's the presumption, makes me really sad. And that's not to say that I wouldn't benefit. Like, look, the telescope images would be amazing. Like, I know that. I think a lot of the people who are contesting it know that. But importantly, there are other things in the world besides our curiosity and getting those particular astronomical images. And I don't see the scientific community shifting to an understanding that sometimes people are simply going to say no, and no is the end of the conversation. Like, we're not Cher and Clueless, great adaptation of Jane Austen's Emma, where, getting the failing grade is just a starting point for negotiations. Like, sometimes that's the end of negotiations, and that's it. And I don't think that the scientific community has gotten to that point where people understand that sometimes no is the answer, and we have to get there for our own sake. Looking at global warming, like the fact that outside my window here in New Hampshire, we're heading into late November and there's still green outside. Like, my lawn has not died even a little bit. There's been no snow. What if we had said no to rapidly evolving a fossil fuel economy?
Role models were few and far between for you. You were well into graduate school before you spent time with a Black woman who was a researcher in a field even close to yours. Marcel Suarez Santos became the first Black woman to earn a PhD in cosmology just a year before you, which is mind-boggling to me. And so where did you pull those sources of inspiration from, those senses of possibility about how you wanted to chart your course within the research field that you'd chosen?
I think I was very lucky to grow up in a family where it was well understood that I should be able to do this. And so that just had to be, like, there was no official, like, law of the universe that said someone like me couldn't be a theoretical physicist. And so any barrier that was getting in the way of that was just garbage that had to be taken out. In some sense. I think I was really, like, it literally, like, never occurred to me that, like, this is something people like me just don't do. And, you know, so when you asked me earlier to describe barriers, that wasn't a barrier that occurred to me. And I think it is a barrier that actually ends up being the first one for a lot of people, is that it just doesn't, like, I went into that documentary with the kind of mindset that allowed me to consider the possibility that I could be just like Stephen Hawking. Even though there were a lot of ways in which he and I were different, right? I didn't see that difference as a barrier. I did see the difference, and I was fine with it, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I was just like, we're just different physically. Like, that's fine. We're from different countries. It's cool, whatever. So I think that mindset really served me well. Again, I think that my mom played a really big role in cheering me on and never questioning what I was doing. And I was also very lucky that my mom ensured that I never felt financially responsible for taking care of other people. And so I just had to worry about my money. I didn't have to worry about other people's money. And that was an incredible gift to me that my mother gave me. Which, like, it's unfortunate that anybody has to take those things into account. But I think that was a big piece of it. I was also very active for a long time in the National Society of Black Physicists. And so I was, as I could, finding other Black people who were excited about physics. And so I was getting that mirrored back to me in various ways. And that was important.
Science is a set of research methodologies, but it's also a social practice. And as you make yourself aware of doing science within a social tradition, has that changed the way you do science, or the way that you encourage the science around you to be done?
I mean, like, on a micro level, sometimes I have to remind myself just to do the calculation and not watch myself do the calculation. I mean, even, like, you know, you asked me the question about particle cosmology, and first I had to give you the answer about, like, the complexities of me and Katie choosing different words. I'm sorry. That's what my brain does now, right? So that's definitely a piece of it. You all have, like, witnessed and experienced that part of it. I do think that I think much more proactively now that I run my own research group. I have 3 graduate students. I have a postdoc. I had an undergraduate for a while. I'm much more aware of what are the social dynamics that are shaping that group, what are my responsibilities to them as junior scholars, and the different identities that they bring into the room. I think about that in a very conscious way that I don't think a lot of my colleagues at other institutions. I will say that my colleagues at the University of New Hampshire are really aware, and I love my department so much. But I don't think that that's, like, a norm for the field to think in those terms. I'm also thinking a lot, you know, in the scientific collaborations that I'm in outside of my department, outside of my research group, about what are the dynamics? Right now, I'm helping to lead a national particle physics planning process, and I'm one of 3 people responsible for cosmic probes of dark matter in we approached including people in the work that we were doing in a way that I think was very shaped by my understanding of social dynamics and what it means to genuinely encourage people who might feel otherwise locked out to participate. To make sure that junior scholars are included, to make sure that women of color and men of color and queer people feel like this is a space where they can belong and do their scientific work.
What have the last 2 years been like for you as a scientist? Because there's certainly one stereotype that says it's like head down, blackboard or whiteboard, doing the math, being alone with your thoughts. And then there's that idea of having other scientists around, of the collective energy that you tap into that makes universities and institutes so valuable. How was it when you got cut off from that?
I went into this with a lot of advantages. So first of all, I was visiting the UC Santa Barbara Kavli Institute for Theoretical Physics at the start of the pandemic. And so I was already doing everything virtually because I was away from home base. So I was already on Zoom with my entire research group on a regular basis. And so absolutely nothing changed, except eventually I came back to the East Coast and my sleeping schedule shifted a little bit. Initially, I went into it thinking that people would behave reasonably, and so we would be locked down for a few months. I'm the spouse of a public health professional, and so I also, unfortunately, did the back of the envelope calculation of how many people would die if we didn't take necessary precautions. And unfortunately, I got the order of magnitude right. I did it based on how many people had died in the Spanish flu pandemic, which killed my great-grandfather. And so I was actually very aware in a very familial sense of what the impact of these things could be. So I thought, okay, it'll be a few months. I'm going to use these few months to take advantage of not having to commute and make something out of that extra time and getting a break from flying for the first time in my life, basically. And I was naive, as I often am.
Hopeful.
Yes, I was hopeful, partly because, I didn't think about how my sense of responsibility, even to my research group, to my graduate students who were having a very different experience with this than I was, how that would shift my emotional conditions and my sense of responsibility, and having to balance between, I can't just have them not doing anything, because actually sitting in your apartment all day not doing anything is probably not great, but also realizing that they're not going to be doing things or able to do things in the same way that they were doing them before psychologically, and finding that balance point. And, then also supporting friends who don't have a spouse or don't have partners who could be in the home with them, and so who were deeply lonely. There were just all of those pieces and that I didn't think about in terms of how it would impact me. I thought I just was advantaged in this situation, which I was. But I also ended up doing a lot of support work. And then, of course, I didn't realize that, so many Black people were going to be killed in such horrifying ways by the police, even though, Ahmaud Arbery, by the time the pandemic kicked off, had already been killed. And so 2020 was, I don't know. I think I still went into this with a lot of advantages, but I feel tired. I feel very, very tired. I read New Hampshire Public Radio News every day, and we have between 3 and 10 people dying every day in a state with fewer than 2 million people. And it's weird to get used to that.
Was the book being written through this, or were you in the end stages of it as this was all unfolding?
So I worked on the second draft of the book in February of 2020. And so I turned it in, and then kind of all hell broke loose, and things slowed down at my publisher. There was a lot of time dilation, and, and particularly, my publisher is based in New York, and what the people in New York went through, I think that there's just a whole community that's traumatized just by the sound of ambulances at this point. I had lots of friends who were just hearing ambulances constantly. And that's now, I can imagine hearing an ambulance now and what that would evoke for a lot of them. I would say the other thing that was happening in 2020 that became part of the book unexpectedly was the fires in California, which I experienced tremendous amounts of grief about, continue to experience tremendous amounts of grief about, that ultimately led to my mom moving out of the house I was born in. So there was this a lot happening that did end up in the book, although I don't think I really talk about the pandemic in the book because I didn't know what to say at that point other than this sucks. We had reached that stage by the time I was turning in the final thing where everybody was like, I don't have anything to say about this.
This is a book with a lot of facets. There is a lot of particle physics, and yet you can turn it and there is history, both history of science, history of women in science. You can turn it again and see the social science of science, and you can turn it again and see your own personal history and experience. So take me back to when this book was first starting to form for you. When did it take the shape that it did, and what were some of the things that you were thinking about as it first came together?
I wrote the first draft. This is going to sound really obnoxious. I wrote the first draft primarily during a 3-week visit at the Aspen Center for Physics in 2019.
Yeah, every writer listening to this hates you right now. So.
And one of the reasons that it happened so quickly is that the original concept was that it was going to be an essay collection based on essays that I had already published that were criticizing science and talking about what wasn't working right in the scientific community. And so I was able to start for my first draft with about a quarter, not even a quarter, but a good fifth of the book where I had something that I was working with. The chapter Black People Are Luminous Matter is based on a Twitter thread that I literally grabbed the entire Twitter thread and cut and pasted it into Scrivener and then wrote a chapter around it, right? I was very lucky. I had ideal conditions. I didn't have access to good TV at that point, and I had a spouse who just put water next to me when I ran out and makes sure that I eat meals on a semi-regular schedule and that sort of thing. So going into it, I thought it was just going to be this essay collection. And then during that time, maybe because I was at Aspen and we were there as part of a dark matter workshop. I think it was either cosmology or dark matter or something. But I was surrounded by a bunch of particle physicists and cosmologists. That I was realizing that one of my dreams when I was graduating from high school was that I wanted to write my own A Brief History of Time, but I wanted to write it for East LA. I wanted to write it for the community that I came from, and that maybe didn't feel seen by popular science writing or didn't think that popular science writing was for them. We didn't have independent movie theaters that showed Errol Morris documentaries in East LA. We didn't really have a bookstore. We didn't even really have a supermarket. And that was what I had wanted to do. And I was like, how is it that I have this book deal? And that's not what I'm doing. And so then I had planned to include a little bit about science just to kind of be and here's the science that I do too. But then it became a really big piece. And suddenly the book was broken into 4 phases. And the first phase was the science. Mm-hmm. I think in hindsight, if the book works, I'm going to try and be humble here. If the book works, part of the way that it works is that by the time you get to phase 4, where I'm talking to you about Black feminism in physics and ending racial totalitarianism and all of these heavy duty social science aspects of it, you're feeling hype about wanting to do science in this better context because I was so stoked about science at the beginning. And I have made the case to you for why particle physics and cosmology rock. And so at the end, you're I don't want to get rid of particle physics. I want particle physics to be awesome in our awesome future where we are all in good relations with each other. So I think that, and that sounds like me. So I feel like it's a good reflection of me in the end. But, the one thing that I will say to anybody who's thinking about writing about this, there are other scientists, I I really had to write to find out that that was the story that I wanted to tell. It was not obvious to me before I sat down to write the book and actually format it that that was the story I wanted to tell. And thank goodness for Scrivener, too. Shout out to the Scrivener people.
And I mean, you've called out over your own history, some of these books that really are like the pillars of popular science writing. Brief History of Time, Carl Sagan's Cosmos, like books that just kind of open up science, physics, cosmology for people. Had you seen anyone else out there addressing that combination of science and in either social or historical writing that gave you some guideposts for where you were going?
I think because of the title of the Disordered Cosmos, that the natural Carl Sagan reference point is cosmos, right? And I talked about how that was important for me. But I actually think that the most influential Carl Sagan book for this particular text was his last essay collection, Billions and Billions, which is like a deeply personal collection that is a love note to science, but it's a love note to humanity. And it's like, damn it, people, get yourselves together note.
Right.
Like, he's like, I'm dying, but you guys have got to get this together. And I think that I wrote with Billions and Billions as kind of a map in some sense. And at the same time, I was also thinking about Janna Levin's first book, How the Universe Got Its Spots, which I think a lot of people know her for her later book on black holes. But she wrote this, like, again, very personal book about being a theoretical astrophysicist that I found in a bookstore right as I was graduating from college, I think. And so I was also thinking about the way that both of those books gave me permission to say science is a personal phenomenon and it is a social phenomenon. And then I think, there were other books that are not naturally read as science books, particularly like Kiese Lehman's How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America, where it's such an incredible essay collection where he also did things that you don't expect. Like even there's one chapter that's him exchanging letters with other people. And so I think the reason there's a letter to my mother at the end of The Disordered Cosmos is because of How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America.
And so, when all the work is done, when you're finished for the day, what do you read for fun?
So I was actually reading Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen last night.
Excellent.
I just got one of the Belknap Press at Harvard University Press annotated editions of all of the novels, and so I decided that I wanted to do another read through because it's been a while. A novel that I read this year that just like blew me out of the water. I'm a hardcore fiction person. Despite all of the other books that I've named, I'm a really hardcore fiction person. Caitlin Greenidge's Liberty is an absolutely phenomenal novel. It just came out earlier this year, and I was lucky enough to be in conversation with her, and so I've gotten to chat with her about the book. But that has been one of my top reads of the year. I'm not a big fantasy person. I actually got over my dad actually took The Lord of the Rings away from me when I was like 15 because I kept reading it over and over again. And then I actually kind of think that the movies ruined it for me. So I'm like over it. And not really a fantasy reader. But I picked up over the winter holiday last year, Tracy Dion's Legendborn, and couldn't put it down, was so obsessed that I made my spouse read it, and then I would interrupt him and be like, what part are you at? Tell me what's going on. Like, I just wanted to like re-experience the book again. And so I'm like super stoked about the second book, Bloodmarked. And then I like short stories, and so I'm a huge fan of Elizabeth Crane's short stories. My favorite one by Elizabeth Crane, maybe my favorite short story of all time, is Star Babies. So good. You can find it online for free, actually, but it's also in a collection. Grab it. Perfect. Star Babies. They're so amazing.
If you had a megaphone that would reach the ear of every science-curious black kid on every bus in the world, what would you tell them?
The stars are your ancestral heritage. The night sky belongs to you.
Chanda, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I've been speaking with Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein, author of The Disordered Cosmos, A Journey into Dark Matter, Spacetime, and Dreams Deferred. Find it and all of the books we've spoken about, and we have spoken about many, at kobo.com/conversation. Check the show notes for a link. Make sure to catch every conversation by subscribing wherever you listen. Kobo in Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj and hosted by me, Michael Tamplin. Thank you for listening.